Now, the title and topic of this video might come as a surprise to some people, but given my academic background, it shouldn't be surprising to many. And for those of you who are relative newcomers to my channel, who've only heard me talk about politics, sex differences, and race differences, that actually is not my background. That's a kind of relatively new interest, the past decade or so. My academic background has actually been historically in historical linguistics, no pun intended. I specialized in Germanic languages, and I had a specialty within Germanic languages in the German language itself, as well as the English language, with a specialty within English language, which is to say, I had a primary focus on Anglo-Saxon, Middle English, early modern English, the history of the English language, its development, and I did a fair bit of medieval history as well, much less so on the continent, and I focused primarily on the medieval history of Great Britain. And in addition to other stuff, I did classics as well, but my main focus academically in my youth, throughout my 20s, had been basically Great Britain with a focus on English language and development, as well as some history. So that shouldn't surprise people, now you know. But why would I even cover a topic like this? It's not a topic that interests many people, I would suspect. Elsewise, I would do more videos on this subject. It's in some ways, it's much more enjoyable than dealing with controversial subjects. Although I'm not afeared, as it were, that's what they say in Witcher 3, to cover such topics. This is kind of more relaxing, and in some ways more interesting. It's kind of that kind of knowledge that it's just kind of interesting to know. So, in any event, it came up as a consequence of an exchange I had on my video on the problem with the Aborigines in Australia. Some exchanges back and forth between some people, including myself, as to what the Scots language was. One gentleman was confused and thought and claimed actually it was Scots Gaelic or Gaelic, as it's referred to in the actual language. And this came about itself as a result of me mentioning that Hume had urged his fellow speakers, Scots speakers, to learn English, and I guess that wasn't exactly clear. So I thought, you know what, I can put together a video, an overview, a brief overview of the linguistic map, as it were, of Scotland, both historically and in modern times. And this is not meant to be all-inclusive and expansive or even authoritative. These are the general observed historical facts and probabilities to the best of my knowledge of what I had studied, and I've tried to keep up with it for quite some time, even in my advanced years. So this is basically an idea for beginners, for those who are interested, as to what the languages of Scotland have been historically, how they developed, and some of their distinctions. So with that said, let us launch into it. So it's safe to say we know virtually nothing about the linguistic situation of Britain prior to the two major waves of Celtic speakers, which is to say, we know they spoke some language, obviously, a language that had been around by then, the dwellers and inhabitants of Britain, but almost certainly not Indo-European. We don't know. They didn't leave any written records, so we don't really know very much about that. So the first observable phenomenon we can actually look at is related to Celtic languages. Now, as I said, there were two major waves that took place during the Celtic migrations. There was the first wave of what are called Gàidhlig speakers, and I'll be explaining the differences in a bit between the Celtic languages, as well as Celtic itself, that took place during the mid-late Bronze Age, about 1200. The Bronze Age in Britain was fairly extensive. It was about 2500 BC to about 800 BC, so it's still well within the Bronze Age. And then significantly later, you have an Iron Age invasion or migration by Brittonic speakers from the continent, a different language group of Celtic languages, about approximately 500 BC. And these, of course, are the ones that Caesar encounters. More on that in a bit. So we know that happened with a relative certainty or probability. But before that, it's just a mystery. We don't know what languages the ancient Britons spoke, the prehistoric Britons, rather. So there's that. So really, when we're talking about Scotland, because that is the focus of this video, we need to first talk about the Picts. Now, when I first started studying the subject matter in the 90s, there seemed to be some dispute as to whether or not the Picts were indeed Celtic speakers. This, in the ensuing time, seems to have been resolved, which is to say the Picts were almost certainly Celtic speakers, and they spoke some form of Brittonic. Now, before I proceed on talking about the Picts and Celtic languages, let's first give some rough definitions, descriptions of Celtic languages. So all of European languages, with 4 exceptions, which I won't go into now beyond naming them, we have Estonian, we have Finnish, we have Hungarian, and Basque, are Indo-European languages, which is to say related languages. Sometimes they're referred to as being genetically related, but that's to be taken metaphorically and not actually or literally. They're not genetically, languages aren't genetically related to each other, but for the purposes of description, that's how we refer to them. Genetically related languages, constituting a greater family of Indo-European, and then there are sub-branches. There's Germanic, which was my specialty back in the day, Celtic, Slavic, Hellenic, that would be the Greek groups. Hittite is another one. There are many, and I don't need to go into all of them. And Latin is italic. It was one of many in the Roman Peninsula at the time, but Latin ended up winning that battle. So that's not really relevant. So we're talking about Celtic languages. Within the Celtic language group, there are 2 subgroups. There is P-Celtic, which constitutes, in modern times at least, Welsh, Breton, and Cornish, although Cornish has been functionally dead and has been revived by enthusiasts. Cornish has died off, I believe, in the 18th century, the last actual native speaker who was raised with it. But there's been a revival due to, fetishists and enthusiasts. And then as far as Gàidhlig languages are concerned, there's Scots Gaelic, or in the language itself, Gaelic as it's referred to, Manx, which went extinct, I believe, in the 1970s, but there's been some revival there, the Isle of Man, as well as the Greater Irish language, related, but not to be confused with Scots Gaelic. And these are the Q Celtic languages. Why are they called P and Q? Brittonic is referred to as P because all of the languages have a word for 5 that begins with P. And all of the languages in the Gàidhlig family have a word that begins with Q. So Q Celtic and P Celtic. Now, these themselves are mutations or changes because Indo-European, the original sound for 5 was something like kentum, and it changes over time. Neither here nor there. So you have these divisions, Brittonic and Gàidhlig. So the original language of the Picts was almost certainly some variety of Brittonic, probably related to the more general Brittonic spoken there since the arrival of Celts from the continent in Great Britain. And the Picts did not leave official written records. There are inscriptions, some runes of sorts, and from that, academics and scholars can decipher what it is they were speaking and how they went about it. So, yeah, I mean, they probably spoke a Brittonic language. And the Picts were there from approximately that time in the Iron Age to approximately the time of the Anglo-Saxon invasions, and I'll talk more about that in a bit. Lived primarily in northern Scotland and eastern Scotland, but they certainly made forays into the lower areas near Hadrian's Wall, the semi-official divide between England and Scotland to this day. Semi-official, obviously not official, but when the Emperor Hadrian, decided to demarcate the line between what was then Roman Britain and the rest of the island. So, yes, they persist linguistically, and we're really just focusing on the languages here, not the actual history, although I do need to mention some history. And they are mentioned in certain chronicles. For example, we know that probably what happened, but who knows how reliable it is. Bede, the English historian who wrote several centuries later, as well as Gildas, a kind of demented Celtic monk who wrote in the 6th century, they both make reference to a Celtic leader by the name of Vortigern, who invites 2 Germanic leaders, the Anglo-Saxon leaders, Hengist and Horsa, Now, as you know, these are both horse names. Horsa, it should be obvious. Hengist, related to the German word Hengst, and another word for horse. In any event, they come over by invitation of Vortigern, because Vortigern promises them and their tribesmen some plot of land in Great Britain if only they would help in the defeat of the Picts. So you could, right there, you see Celtic speakers, Brittonic speakers at odds with each other, assuming the histories are true. We would have to. Bede was notoriously rigorous as a historian compared to similar men of his time. So it's in all likelihood he did his research, and it's probably true. And they succeed in helping them. They realize, well, these Celts are really weak. Why don't we just wipe them out and steal their land? Long story short, that's kind of what happened. But this isn't like a story about the history or really England. Maybe another video if people are actually interested, but rather Scotland. But English will, of course, play a big role in Scotland. At the same time, approximately the same time, about 449, that is the traditional date of the Anglo-Saxon invasion. Coincidence, also the traditional date of the fall of Rome. It's as if the fates and the gods had worked together conspiratorially to bring about the ruination of both these places. That's a joke, obviously. So at the same time, you have a fairly large scale, by medieval standards, Celtic migration, a new Celtic migration, an Irish migration from Ireland over to the western areas of Scotland, and then later to the Highlands of Scotland. And they brought with them, of course, Irish, Old Irish, a Gàidhlig language. Over time, this language separates from Irish, although Irish itself has many different varieties and dialects within Ireland, into what's known as Scots Gaelic, or Gaelic as it's referred to in the language itself. And so this happens about, what is that, 449, certainly from 500, 600 onwards, it becomes increasingly prominent, and by then the Picts are pretty much gone. And so what you get, because I'll have to talk about the English element here, is a kind of linguistic by about 600 to 700 AD. What you get is a kind of division between Germanic speakers of Scotland in the south, and in the more northern and particularly western areas, Celtic speakers of Gaelic, or Scots Gaelic as it's called in English. Now, you have to remember that at this time, approximately 700 AD, England was not a unified front by any means. We have to remember that England as a nation state was not a unified front, and not really even a unified people, until Alfred the Great comes along in the 9th century. And that's a story unto itself, well worthy of a video or discussion, but neither here nor there. What's relevant here is the existence of the so-called Anglo-Saxon heptarchy, the kingdom of seven, as it were, heptarchy, referring to a rule of seven from the Greek word for seven. And they refer to Northumbria in the far north, Mercia or Mercia, some people say, I say Mercia, in the middle, smack in the middle, East Anglia to the far east, Essex right below that, and Sussex below Essex, and then Kent to the far right, and Wessex then in the southwest. And we have to understand that Northumbria, the kingdom of Northumbria, constituted not just modern England. So yes, York was to the far south of the kingdom of Northumbria, but Northumbria extended well into the lower areas of Scotland and encompassed Edinburgh, in fact. And so what you got linguistically by 700 was a large English-speaking population of the Northumbrian variant. And I don't need to go into that would be a separate video. There were distinctions in the language of Old English, as there always are. You can see them in textual evidence. Northumbrian is distinct from the southern variants in several different ways, but it's not really important. But you do get it's a type of English, and it ate up, that is Northumbria, the kingdom of Northumbria, large swaths of Scotland, and so the language was planted there by the Anglo-Saxons. This is way, way before any modern or even pre-modern definitions of England or Scotland existed. So that's essentially the linguistic division we have in Scotland by about 700 AD already, and this persists for quite some time, a few centuries forward into the Middle Ages, and continues to do so for quite some time. As we come to, so we have the Scots Gaelic in the north. This is just a quick overview again. Scots Gaelic in the north and in the west, particularly in the Highlands. And in the east and the lowlands, you get Scots. And we'll talk about what Scots actually is in a bit, but Scots is the English language, the Germanic language. Some people call it a variety of English, others say it's its own language, whatever. So we have this picture which persists for centuries and centuries until we come to the time of an infamous time in Scottish history, at least for some people, referred to as the Highland clearances. Now, this is a video about the language situation in Scotland, but some history is inevitable. The Highland clearances were a historical period. Most of it took place during the 18th and 19th centuries, though there is historical precedent for that prior because of the nature of Highland clans and the fact that there were some issues prior to that. Not that important, like I said, I want to keep it relevant. Part of this is related to the Jacobite uprisings in the 17th and 18th century. I mean, the fact that if I recall right, the Jacobite uprisings took periodically went on for approximately a century, the mid 17th century to the mid 18th century. So 48 to 45 or 46, I believe, 1648 to 1745 or 46 off the top of my head. In any event, I don't want to get into politics now, that's just a completely separate topic, but what this has, what the effect this has on the status of Gaelic, I will use the English word for it rather than Gaelic, of Scots Gaelic is that a lot of people die, a lot of people leave, actually. So some of the first imports into North America were actually Scots Gaelic speakers who were leaving, English oppression, however you want to term it. I'm not going to use these terms used by the oppression Olympicis, but they were leaving a bad situation. And many of them moved to North America, not just in the United States, but also in places like Nova Scotia and Newfoundland. A lot of these people from the Highlands and we'll get into the Hebrides in a bit, moved from there to North America, Canada, the United States, etc. Now, this had a devastating effect on the continuity and the maintenance of the Scots Gaelic language itself, because all of a sudden speakers of the language were uprooted, they weren't there anymore, people died, and increasingly due to modernization and industrialization, there was pressure to basically leave that culture behind. Now, you have to understand that Scottish clan culture was effectively semi-feudal. It wasn't a modern setup, and it was very primitive. We have to be honest. I've always found it fascinating. I love Scotland and have my own personal history with the place, both the people I interacted as well as my sojourns there. But we have to be honest that Scots Gaelic culture was very primitive by any standard. And by the 18th century, they were basically the boonies. They were living in the boonies. It's just a fact. So the language suffers as a consequence. Now, all the while, there is a growth in awareness of the English language in the South, where a variety of English is spoken. Now, this is where the confusion comes from. Scots, the language Scots, is not a reference to Scots Gaelic. It is a reference to the Germanic variant of English, or the Germanic language Scots itself. Now, to give you an idea of how different it was, I mentioned that Hume spoke Scots, and that was his native language, and had adopted the English language and had urged his fellow Scotsmen to do the same. I want to read a snippet off of an essay, and I'll be linking to this. I'll be linking to various things, so if you want to learn more about the subject matter and what have you, you can in the low bar. The title of this, is David Hume an English Philosopher? Surely Not. And I want to get to the relevant parts. So, David Hume an English Philosopher. Oh dear. Hume was born and raised in Scotland. He spoke Scots and maintained his broad Scotch accent all his life. Despite diplomatic service in France and mixing with English men of letters in London. He would never have described himself as English. If anything, besides Scottish, he was British. He agreed with many others in the Enlightenment that ambitious Scots should sanitize their speech of Scotticisms. He even published an essay on the subject. His friend, Adam Smith, who acquired an Oxford English accent replaceable in his social hours when he spoke Scots from his 6 years, 1740 to 46 residence in England, was also advised by his patron, Lord Kames, to take advantage of his acquired gift and use it to his advantage when teaching, which he did during 1748 to 1751 in his Edinburgh lectures. Hume, Smith, and others were, of course, subjects of the British king, and Britain was the better for it, and they suffered no debates on whether they were nationals or foreigners, sometimes describing themselves as citizens of the world. While there was prejudice against the Scots for many years in England, it was done on a scale, yada, yada, yada. The point of that, I mean, this isn't really about the linguistic situation in further parts of the essay, but they spoke a different language. It would have been unintelligible to us and even to someone like Millennial Woes, although I don't know how well Millennial Woes understands the Scots language. Now, the Scots language, as is pointed out in the essay, receives its own sanitizing force for reasons mentioned, which is to say, increasingly there was a prevalence of the English language. People who wanted to achieve status realized in the lowlands that they could not just keep on speaking Scots, this dialect or variety of English or language into itself, and sort of get by and rise in the ranks of society, which, you know, is to say that Hume spoke with this accent. It's almost indubitable, but he wrote a very fine, very crisp, very elegant English, and he taught himself to do that. But yeah, there was a lot of encouragement there. So the lowlands variety of language, the Germanic language, experiences the same kind of phenomenon. Now, there's a little bit more resistance there that persists well into the present. For example, there is a famous Scottish poet by the name of Robert Burns. He wrote in the 18th century, and he did write in standard English, but he was very much a kind of Scots nationalist of sorts, and he is generally regarded as the sort of the national poet of Scotland, and people appreciate his stuff. He wrote in Scots. You can look this up online if you want to see what it looks like. It can be quite different from standard English, but you know, as modernity persists, there's less and less a demand for that, and people want to acclimate and rise in the ranks of society, and so Scots becomes an obstacle to that. So we fast forward to the present, more or less, and we get a very different picture. So for the most part, you don't get a lot of Scots Gaelic speakers. In fact, I doubt there are very few at all. There's some enthusiasts still. The last time I visited the Outer Hebrides in the early 2000s, as well as the Inner Hebrides, Isle of Skye, this is... you can check this out if you're not familiar with the geography. The Outer Hebrides are a chain of islands. Isle of Lewis is the big one in the northwest of Scotland, and the Inner Hebrides are a chain of islands attached to the mainland. Partly, at least, Skye is the Isle of Skye is more or less attached to the mainland. There's a bridge that connects the mainland to the Isle of Skye, but that's where you still find Scots Gaelic as a language, a spoken language, but increasingly in very, very small numbers. In fact, I even remember in the late 90s and early 2000s, last time was in the Hebrides, that you would hear, I'd have discussions with the locals, and they were talking about how the young people are leaving for places like Glasgow and Edinburgh because you couldn't find work there, the economy wasn't there just wasn't a lot going on, and with it dies the language. Of course, there are preservationists who want to preserve this stuff, but it's just not very popular. And in the Highlands itself, I mean, it's basically gone. I mean, some people might still speak it. Now, of course, what the BBC has done and others, there are Scots Gaelic language channels, but this is an artifact. This is not something that most people in Scotland do not speak it. There are a few native speakers, but it's the numbers have dwindled tremendously. As far as Scots language is concerned, not Scots Gaelic, but Scots, the Germanic language, it still exists, but most people speak some variety of English. The confusing accent of Glaswegian, that is the English of Glasgow, is not necessarily Scots. It should not be confused with that. It's just a sort of regional variety. And Edinburgh itself, being regarded as sort of posh land, it is the poshest of the posh in Scotland. I mean, they tend to have a posh accent. I think by anyone who's familiar, by any estimation, the language that, for example, Millennial Woe sports when he speaks English is a posh Scottish accent. It's identifiably Scottish, but it has an element of poshness. Whereas, getting Jimmy McGriggle from the streets of Glasgow, he probably wouldn't have that same poshness. So, I mean, that's basically, these days, what the situation looks like. Very, very few Scots Gaelic speakers. Most speakers in Scotland are speakers of some variety of standard English, albeit with very strange and sometimes difficult to decipher accents. And the Scots language itself, yes, there are some aficionados and some enthusiasts, but it is not something that that's commonplace that you're going to hear all the time. You will hear unintelligible Scottish varieties and variants, but they're not necessarily the Scots language itself, and that's something that should be borne in mind. I hope that has been a not so concise overview. I'm not known for being concise necessarily, but I think it was an accessible overview of the linguistic picture of Scotland. And there's so much more to say. I skipped over history. I didn't go into the details. I mean, the Jacobite uprisings were quite an interesting period, but that's history, and I don't want to turn this video into an hour-long lecture. And this is, I'm all off the top of my head. I mean, this is stuff that I studied and learned quite a bit about back in the day. I can't do these videos too often. I don't have the feeling the audience finds them terribly interesting. But, if there's demand or interest, I would certainly wouldn't mind doing more videos on British languages in Britain, English language, medieval British history, and what have you. I do actually have planned a video at some point in time on the topic of genetics and linguistics in Britain, because it's quite an interesting seeming paradox that had gone on there. I haven't done the research. I've done some research in the past, but I want to save that for a later day. But anyway, thanks for tuning in. That is the overview of the linguistic situation in Scotland. And if you enjoyed it, leave a like. And feel free to leave comments if you feel that you learned something, or you didn't, or you want to learn more, or whatever. Everyone enjoy the rest of your weekend, and bye-bye. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.